For 11 years after Diane Ferreira disappeared, her parents continued to use the same accountant. He filed their taxes every February. He sat across the desk from them in his office on Broad Street in Cranston and discussed their retirement portfolio and the interest on their savings account, and whether the deduction for the new furnace would carry through to the following year. He asked after their son Michael, who had moved to Connecticut. He shook their hands when the appointment was finished. He walked them to the door. He knew exactly where their daughter was. He had known since the night she disappeared. His name was Vincent Callahan. He was 51 years old when Diane went missing, a trim, careful man who had run a small but respected tax preparation and bookkeeping practice in Cranston for 22 years. He had been the Ferreira family's accountant since 1979. He had filed Diane's first tax return for her when she took her nursing job at Women and Infants Hospital. Because her father had sent her to Vincent as a matter of course, he was the family's accountant. That was what you did. Vincent Callahan sat across a desk from Frank and Rosa Ferreira for 11 years of February appointments, and they thanked him every time. And he accepted their thanks, and he drove home. He was arrested in 2003. The evidence that finally broke the case open was not forensic, and it was not a confession. It was a set of financial records that Callahan himself had created, preserved with the meticulous instinct of a man who had spent his entire career making sure the numbers told the right story, and that had, in the end, told a different story than he intended. But before we get to those records, and to what they revealed, we have to go back to Cranston, Rhode Island, in the spring of 1992. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Diane Ferreira was. Cranston sits just south of Providence, the kind of close-in suburb that shares a border with the city but has its own distinct character, its own parishes, its own neighborhoods folded one into the next. Its own sense of itself as a place that has been here longer than most people remember and intends to remain. In 1992, it was a city of about 76,000 people, densely residential. The streets lined with triple-deckers and aluminum-sided ranches that went back to the post-war era. The kind of housing stock where 3 generations of the same family might live within 4 blocks of each other and consider that arrangement entirely normal. The Ferreiras were that kind of family. Frank had worked for the Rhode Island Department of Transportation for 30 years. Rosa had worked the lunch shift at a diner on Reservoir Avenue for 12 and was known, according to everyone who sat at her counter, for her coffee and her unwillingness to let anyone sit alone and look sad without asking what was wrong. They had bought their house on Budlong Road in 1968, the year Diane was born, and they were still there in 1992, and they are still there today. Diane was 24 years old in the spring of 1992, the younger of 2 children, a registered nurse who had been working the pediatric floor at Women and Infants Hospital in Providence for 18 months, and who had, by the accounts of her colleagues and the parents of her patients, a quality that good pediatric nurses need above all others. She made frightened children feel like the hospital was a manageable place. She had a collection of small animal stickers that she kept in her scrubs pocket and distributed with clinical seriousness to any child who demonstrated what she called extraordinary courage, which she defined broadly enough to include surviving an IV placement and, on one occasion, successfully eating green Jell-O. She had brown eyes and her mother's directness, and a way of filling a room without raising her voice. She lived in an apartment in Providence's south side, 15 minutes from the hospital, with a tabby cat named Walter, who had 1 torn ear and an imperious disposition that Diane found charming. She drove a blue Honda Civic. She called her parents on Sundays and sometimes on Thursdays if a shift had been particularly hard. She was saving money for a trip to Portugal, her grandparents' homeland, that she had been planning since her college graduation. She also, according to Rosa, had a standing unease about Vincent Callahan that she had never been able to fully articulate. She had gone to his office twice for her own tax returns, and both times she had come home and told her mother that he made her uncomfortable. Something in how he watched her. Something she couldn't name. Rosa had told her she was probably imagining it. Vincent had been their accountant for 13 years. He was a careful, professional man. Diane had not gone back to his office after that second visit. The last time Rosa Ferreira saw her daughter was the evening of April the 9th, 1992. Diane had come for dinner on a Thursday. One of the hard weeks, Rosa thought. Because she had called midweek, and her voice had the particular flatness it got when the job had taken too much. They had eaten together at the kitchen table. Diane had played with the cat her parents had borrowed from a neighbor's litter the previous fall. She had helped Rosa with the dishes, and she had kissed both her parents at the door, and she had driven her blue Honda Civic away down Budlong Road. Rosa stood at the front window and watched the car turn the corner. She went back to her program on the television. By 10 o'clock she was in bed. By 10:30, something had happened on the 20-minute drive between Budlong Road and Diane's apartment in Providence that Rosa Ferreira would spend the next 11 years trying to understand. Diane's neighbor, a man named Peter Souza, who lived in the apartment below hers, heard her door at approximately 11 o'clock that evening. He noticed the time because he was watching the late news, and he thought it was later than usual for her to be coming in. He did not hear anything after that. He thought nothing of it until Friday morning, when he encountered a different problem. Walter the cat was crying behind the apartment door at 7 a.m. in a sustained, distressed way that Peter had never heard from him before. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. He went to work, came home at 6 in the evening, and the cat was still crying. He called the building manager. The building manager used her key at 6:40 Friday evening. The apartment was empty. The lights were off. Walter was in the kitchen next to an empty food bowl. Diane's purse was on the counter. Her hospital ID badge was on the hook by the door, where she always left it when she came in. Her bed had not been slept in. The Providence Police Department was called at 7:15 p.m. On April the 10th, the case was transferred to the Rhode Island State Police Missing Persons Unit the following morning, when the investigating officers determined there were no signs of struggle in the apartment and no explanation for Diane's absence consistent with voluntary departure. The detective assigned to the case was a state police investigator named Margaret Susi, 40 years old, a North Providence native with 14 years on the force, and a specific expertise in missing persons cases that had led her unit chief to put her name on this one within hours of the transfer. She understood immediately that the apartment told only half the story. The purse on the counter, the badge on the hook, those were the details of a woman who had arrived home. But the bed that had not been slept in and the cat that had not been fed suggested that whatever happened had happened very shortly after she walked through the door. She interviewed Peter Souza. She interviewed every resident in the building. She canvassed the block between the parking area and the building entrance. She pulled the records of Diane's recent phone calls and cross-referenced them against her known contacts, her hospital colleagues, her friends. One name appeared in the phone records 3 times in the 2 weeks before Diane disappeared, at hours that struck Sosie as unusual. Vincent Callahan's office line. The calls were short, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and had been placed in the evenings, not during business hours. When Susie asked Frank Ferreira about it, he said that Vincent sometimes called clients at home if there was a tax matter that needed addressing before a deadline. He said this without suspicion. He said it the way you talk about a person you have trusted for 13 years. Susie interviewed Callahan on April 15th, 6 days after Diane disappeared. He was measured, concerned in a calibrated way, and precisely as helpful as a man with nothing to hide would be expected to be. He confirmed the calls, a question about a deduction on Diane's return, he said, which she had handled herself that year. He said he was devastated by the news. He asked Susie if there was any way he could assist. She noted his demeanor in her case file. She flagged the calls. She had no evidence to go further. Diane's blue Honda Civic was never found. Her body was not found that spring, or that summer, or that year. By 1996, 4 years had passed since Diane disappeared. Frank Ferreira had retired from the Department of Transportation in 1994 and found that retirement without answers was a particular kind of stillness that felt nothing like rest. He drove the route from Budlong Road to Diane's old apartment building in Providence periodically, with no purpose he could have named, because movement felt better than sitting with what he knew. Rosa continued her lunch shifts at the diner on Reservoir Avenue. Her regulars knew, because small communities always know, and they were kind in the careful way people are kind when they cannot fix the thing that is broken. Michael, Diane's brother, had moved to Connecticut before Diane disappeared, and the guilt of that geography, irrational, unanswerable, sat with him through all those years. He came home for every anniversary. He sat with his parents at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph of Diane that Rosa had put on the sideboard. Diane in her nursing scrubs, grinning at something off camera, and he did not know what to say that hadn't already been said. Vincent Callahan continued to file the Ferreira family taxes. Margaret Susie had been promoted to sergeant by 1998 and had moved into a supervisory capacity. But she had arranged with her successor in the missing persons unit to keep her name on the Ferreira case as an informal consultant. She re-interviewed Callahan in 1997, 5 years after Diane disappeared. He was still measured. He was still precisely as concerned as a man with nothing to hide. She left his office on Broad Street that afternoon with the unshakable conviction of a seasoned investigator and nothing she could take to a prosecutor. She called the Ferreira family after that interview. She told them what she could, which was not much. Frank thanked her. Rosa asked her to please not give up. Susie told her she had not given up and did not intend to. She had not given up. Neither had the Ferreiras, who kept their February appointment with Vincent Callahan, and who, in all that time, had never known what they were sitting across from. Every case on this channel is the result of weeks of research, of finding the thread and following it wherever it leads. If this kind of work matters to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely helps. Now let's get back to the records, and to what they finally revealed. The break in the Ferreira case came not from a new witness, not from a DNA match, and not from a confession. It came from a bankruptcy. In the spring of 2003, Vincent Callahan's practice collapsed under a combination of a failed real estate investment and a client dispute that had gone to civil litigation. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in April. The bankruptcy trustee, as required by law, conducted a full review of Callahan's financial records going back 11 years, the standard look-back period for fraud examination. The reviewing accountant, a woman named Susan Faria, working on behalf of the bankruptcy court, found an anomaly in Callahan's 1992 business accounts. In late April of that year, 2 weeks after Diane Ferreira disappeared, Callahan had made a cash payment of $4,300 to a contractor whose business name did not appear in any of his other records. and whose tax identification number, when Faria ran it, resolved to a company that had been dissolved in 1990. The payment was categorized in Callahan's books as a property maintenance expense for an investment property he owned in Coventry. Faria flagged it as a potential fraudulent deduction and passed it to the IRS examiner assigned to the bankruptcy. The IRS examiner, whose name was David Chen, ran the contractor's dissolved business registration and found it had been owned by a man with 2 prior convictions for illegal waste disposal. The kind of contractor, Chen noted in his referral to the Rhode Island State Police Financial Crimes Unit, who did work that you paid for in cash and did not ask questions about. The financial crimes detective who received that referral was a man named Thomas Brand, and Thomas Brand had been a Rhode Island State Police officer for 16 years. He ran the payment through his own searches. He found the contractor. He found the contractor's history. And then he pulled the name Vincent Callahan against the state's unsolved cases database and found the flag that Margaret Susie had placed there 11 years earlier. He called her at home on a Tuesday evening in June 2003. She was retired by then, living in Narragansett. And when he explained what he'd found, she went quiet for a long moment and then said, "I need you to tell me everything." The Coventry property was a 2-acre parcel of undeveloped land that Callahan had purchased in 1988 and never built on. On July 3, 2003, investigators with ground-penetrating radar surveyed the site on the strength of a warrant obtained through Brian's financial investigation. They found what they were looking for in the northeast corner of the property, beneath a section of ground that had been disturbed and then left to settle for 11 years. Diane Ferreira was identified through dental records on July 7, 2003. She had been there since the spring of 1992. Vincent Callahan was arrested at his home in Cranston on the morning of July 9, 11 years and 3 months after Diane Ferreira disappeared. He was 62 years old. He was dressed for the office, old habit, investigators noted later, or old performance. He did not speak when they read the charge. He looked at the floor, and he stayed looking at the floor until they put him in the car. At trial, the prosecution built its case on the financial thread, the cash payment, the dissolved contractor, the property, the timeline that placed the disturbance of the ground within weeks of Diane's disappearance. Forensic evidence recovered at the site, too specific to have been coincidental, connected Callahan to the location beyond reasonable doubt. His defense argued an absence of direct evidence tying him to the act itself. The jury required 6 hours to disagree. Guilty of first-degree murder, Vincent Callahan was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole and was remanded to the adult correctional institutions in Cranston, the city where he had filed taxes for 30 years. He has never spoken publicly about the case. He has never explained the phone calls. He has never explained what happened on the evening of April 9, 1992, in the 20-minute drive between Budlong Road and Diane's apartment in Providence. He has never explained why, for 11 years, he sat across a desk from Frank and Rosa Ferreira and shook their hands. Diane Ferreira would have been 57 years old this year. She would have gone to Portugal. She would have found her grandparents' village in the north, the one her grandmother had described to her in the kitchen on Budlong Road, with the stone walls and the river and the market on Saturday mornings. And she would have stood in it and understood something about herself that she had only ever half understood before. She would have come home and told her mother about it over the phone on a Sunday, and Rosa would have cried, and Diane would have made her laugh about it within 10 minutes, because that was how Diane operated. She would have kept the animal stickers in her scrubs pocket. She would have kept Walter, who lived, for the record, to the improbable age of 17, and died in Rosa's kitchen in 2009. Still imperious, still demanding, still somehow hers. Rosa Ferreira was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was 64 years old. Her son Michael sat beside her. Frank, who had suffered a mild stroke in 2001, watched the proceedings from a chair the court had provided at the family's request. When the foreman said guilty, Rosa reached for Frank's hand and held it, and neither of them spoke for a long time. After the verdict, Rosa was asked by a reporter whether she had ever suspected Vincent Callahan during those 11 years of February appointments. She thought about it for a moment. "I suspected God," she said. "I suspected the road. I suspected everyone and no one." She paused. "I never suspected him because he was so ordinary. He was so ordinary every time. That is the thing about this case that stays with me. The ordinariness. The February appointments. The handshakes. The question about the deduction for the furnace. Callahan was not hiding in plain sight in the dramatic sense. He was not performing grief at a memorial, like Dale Pruitt at Carol's grave. He was doing something quieter and in some ways more terrible. He was simply continuing. He was sitting down at the desk and opening the folder and doing the work. For 11 years. What does it mean that the thing that finally exposed him was his own meticulous record-keeping? He had spent 30 years ensuring that the numbers told the right story. And the numbers told on him anyway, not through error, but through the existence of a payment he couldn't explain to a contractor who no longer existed, on a property where he thought no one would ever look. The truth was in his own books. It was in his own handwriting. It had been there since April 1992, waiting for the right person to read it. What do you think about the 11 years of February appointments? Is there something that strikes you as particularly calculated about that? Or do you think Callahan simply had no choice? And what does this case say about the kind of evidence that actually solves cold cases? Because it wasn't Dina here, and it wasn't a witness. It was a bankruptcy examiner doing a routine audit. Justice found Diane Ferreira after 11 years. Her mother never stopped sitting at the diner counter asking people what was wrong. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists. And if you believe the truth is in the details, somewhere, always, subscribe and check the description for more cases like this one. Thank you for watching.